Well, welcome everyone. My name is Link Kessler. My Indigenous ancestry is Oglala Lakota from Pine Ridge in South Dakota. I work at UBC, and I have the real pleasure tonight of introducing our speakers. And I want to begin, of course, by taking a moment to acknowledge that we're on the traditional and unceded territory of our host nations, in particular Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And we're really fortunate tonight to have some really excellent people to share their thinking with us, and an opportunity following that to have some questions, and following that, a reception downstairs. So pretty good prospect for a good evening. The title of tonight's event is A Subtle Revolution, What Lies Ahead for Indigenous Rights. And it's an event that's marking the 10th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And it is also marking, to some extent, the recent publication of our first speaker, Sheryl Lightfoot's work with the same title as the title of our session. September 13th, 2017 marks the 10-year anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, a document that Canada has endorsed and which the Trudeau government has promised to adopt and implement. The burning question looking forward is, what does implementation mean? And what is required of federal, provincial, and local government, political and social institutions, and civil society to make the UN Declaration a reality in Canada? Dr. Sheryl Lightfoot's 2016 book, Global Indigenous Politics, A Subtle Revolution, from Routledge Press, highlights the fundamental changes involved in Indigenous rights implementation and challenges both state and Indigenous peoples to reformulate their relationship in accordance with its principles. Please join us as Dr. Lightfoot and a distinguished panel of guests discuss her book and its implications for Indigenous rights implementation. So, we have several panelists with us tonight. I will introduce them to you now, and then they will speak in sequence, and then we'll have a chance for some questions. So I want, before doing that, however, to do some acknowledgments and acknowledge that this is a co-presentation of SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement and UBC First Nations and Indigenous Studies program, also sponsored by UBC's Department of Political Science. Thanks to all of these partners for their support. Special thanks to those who helped organize the logistics. Am Johal, Director, SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement, and Professors Sarah Hunt and David Gartner of UBC's First Nations and Indigenous Studies program. I have been asked to remind you that there will be refreshments downstairs following tonight's event. And I think that takes care of the preliminaries. So let me tell you a little bit about the people who we'll be hearing from tonight. Dr. Sheryl Lightfoot is Anishinaabe, a citizen of the Lake Superior Band of Ojibwe, enrolled in the Keymaw Bay Indian community of Baranga, Michigan. She's an associate professor in First Nations and Indigenous Studies and the Department of Political Science, and currently serving as acting chair of First Nations and Indigenous Studies and acting co-director of the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies at UBC. I'm kind of scanning ahead through here, and I think you neglected to include the fact that you're a CRC. So she's a CRC. Oh, no, it's the next sentence. It's been a very long day. I apologize. Sheryl is the Canada Research Chair in Global Indigenous Rights and Politics. She holds a master's degree from the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Michigan, with specialties in foreign policy and international affairs, as well as economics and community development, and a PhD in international relations and political science from the University of Minnesota. She also has 15 years volunteer and contract experience with a number of American Indian tribes and community-based organizations in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, including 9 years as chair of the board of the American Indian Policy Center, a research and advocacy group. Her book, Global Indigenous Politics, Subtle Revolution, was published in May 2016 by Routledge Press in their Worlding Beyond the West, Critical International Relations book series. Dr. Priscilla Settee is a member of the Cumberland House Swampy Cree First Nation and a professor in Indigenous Studies and Women and Gender Studies at the University of Saskatchewan. She has won recognition nationally and internationally as an award-winning professor and as a global educator and activist. She's the author of 2 books, Pimatisiwan, Global Indigenous Knowledge Systems, in 2013, that looks at global indigenous knowledge systems, and The Strength of Women, Keymaw, 2011. I have to tell you that these Cree and Anishinaabe words for a poor Lakota boy are a real challenge. That examines the role of Indigenous women's stories in establishing truth, reconciliation, and social change. Dr. Sethi is working in her 3rd book on Indigenous food sovereignty that will be launched in 2018. She is a kokum to Naya Lily and Lola Rose. Dr. Heidi Kiiwetinepinesiik Stark. Thank you for indulging me. From Turtle Mountain, Ojibwe, is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Victoria. She has a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota. Her research interests include Aboriginal and treaty rights and Indigenous politics in the United States and Canada. She's the co-author of Centering Anishinaabe Studies, Understanding the World Through Stories, with Joel Dorfler and Nigan Sinclair, and is the co-author of American Indian Politics and the American Political System, the 3rd and 4th editions, with Dr. David E. Wilkins. Her research background includes collaborative work with Indigenous communities in the United States and Canada. She was awarded a Shirk Insight Development Grant for her project entitled Sakamay First Nations Governance, which aims to advance the development and resurgence of Anishinaabe political structures and institutions that are informed and shaped by Anishinaabe philosophies, values, and teachings. Rachel Yacaaʔał George is Nachalnuth from the Ahousaht First Nation. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Victoria and holds a master's degree from the University of Amsterdam in Genocide Studies. Her research focuses on the efficacy of redress mechanisms and to facilitate justice for Indigenous communities. Beyond providing an evaluation and critique of the evolution and objectives of reconciliation, her research considers pathways to decolonization through resurgence and storied practice. Finally, Grand Chief Stewart Phillip is serving his 2nd consecutive term as president of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. Over a 14-year period from 1994 to 2008, he served 4 consecutive terms as chief of the Penticton Indian Band, with an additional 10 years as an elected band counselor, and continues to serve as chair of the Okanagan Nation Alliance. In October 2006, the Okanagan Nation, led by the elders of the Penticton Band, acknowledged his lifetime commitment to the defense of Indigenous peoples' title and rights by bestowing upon him and his family the rare honor of the title of Grand Chief. Grand Chief Phillip has taken an active role in the defense of Aboriginal title and rights by readily offering support to Native communities in need. He has taken a personal approach to seeing firsthand the impact of fish farms in the Broughton Archipelago, lobbying on Parliament Hill to defeat the First Nations Government Act, standing with elders of Treaty 8 against oil and gas developments in the Peace River, burning referendum ballots with fellow chiefs in protest, and has stood on the steps of the legislature with 3,000 other people united under the Title and Rights Alliance banner. More recently, he was arrested in a protest on Burnaby Mountain and had joined the protest at Standing Rock. And I would just add that I have never been to an activist event in Vancouver where I have not seen Chief Phillip in attendance and offering his leadership. Grand Chief Phillip has been married for 30 years to his wife, Joan. Sorry? What? 30, oh, okay, I was supposed to, this is an old biography, I was supposed to add 3 to all the years, so my mistake, 33 years. They have 4 grown sons, 2 daughters, and 15 grandchildren. He is currently enjoying his 30th year of sobriety, and in this regard, he is a firm believer in leading by example. So I think we've asked each of our speakers tonight to talk for about 15 minutes, and that will leave us time for some questions before everyone else downstairs eats all the food. So, Dr. Lightfoot.
Whenever I speak after Link, I have to make this adjustment. Well, in addition to acknowledging all of the wonderful people that Link acknowledged, I also want to take a moment to thank my fellow panelists for coming out tonight. With the exception of the Grand Chief, everyone has traveled from some distance to get here, and so I just wanted to thank you and acknowledge that time and trouble that you've made in the middle of the teaching week, by the way. So a special thanks to everyone, and especially to the Grand Chief for joining us tonight. Really appreciate your presence. And I also just want to thank Link for agreeing to serve as moderator. Again, I really appreciate it, and thank you for doing that for us tonight. So to begin, I thought I would begin at the beginning of this conversation by reading from page 1 of the book that Link mentioned that was published in 2016. And it's a perfect place to start because it begins on the morning of September 13th, 2007. So the morning of September 13th, 2007 was clear and sunny, a beautiful day in New York City. At the United Nations, diplomats and representatives from UN member states, dressed in suits and carrying briefcases, looking very serious and businesslike, each took their places in the General Assembly Hall behind the nameplates which identified them by country. That morning, dozens of Indigenous delegates also arrived at the UN General Assembly Hall. The Indigenous delegates, however, while also businesslike and carrying large briefcases, were joyful. Many arrived that morning in their traditional regalia, a colorful sea representing diverse cultures from all over the world, from the Cree in Canada to the Navajo in the United States, the Sami in Northern Europe, Maasai to the Hmong to the Quechua. Hugs were freely shared among the Indigenous delegates as they each took their places in the back and in the side galleries of the UN General Assembly Hall. There were no official engraved nameplates for the Indigenous nations and organizations these delegates represented, although a few nameplates begin to appear in front of some of them, handwritten on pieces of paper, indicating that they represented the Sami Council, Tebtiba, First Nations Summit, Kone, Navajo Nation, CISA. The Indigenous delegates looked truly happy. Some had personally labored more than 30 years to reach this day. At approximately 10:30 a.m., Sheikh Yahya Rashad Al Khalifa, the president of the 61st session of the General Assembly, announced that the Assembly had before it a draft resolution entitled the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the voting would begin. One by one, the representatives of UN member states pushed either green, yellow, or red buttons on their desks, indicating their vote on the declaration. Green, of course, was a vote in favor, while red indicated a vote against, and the yellow button registered abstentions. The Indigenous delegates in the back and on the sides of the room by and for whom this declaration was written, through whose efforts this day had been made possible, did not have a vote. They could only sit and watch the screen in anticipation, a scoreboard of UN member states' votes on the declaration. The scoreboard lit up one by one as each member state vote was tallied. The final vote showed 143 green buttons, 11 yellows, and 4 red votes against. After 30 long years of struggle, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples had passed the UN General Assembly by an overwhelming margin, and the world's indigenous peoples now had an international standard that specifically articulated their human rights. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States had each voted against it. Each of these 4 countries issued statements immediately following the vote to clarify their reasons. All 4 articulated that while they had various concerns about language, process, and even opposition to collective rights, the primary obstacles for them were land rights and self-determination, including and especially the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. Even with the predictable opposition, it did not detract from the jubilation among the Indigenous delegates as handshakes and hugs were freely shared. Andrea Carmen, Executive Director of the International Indian Treaty Council, described it. I was so privileged to sit in the chamber that day, to see the voting on the scoreboard, and realize that after all these years, we finally got the declaration passed. Les Malizer, chairman of the Global Indigenous Caucus, said, "The adoption of the declaration marks a momentous and historic occasion." One Indigenous delegate could hardly speak. He said, "It was great. We're so happy." Another, Grand Chief Ed John from Canadian First Nations Summit, said, it's a tremendous day, and we now have in our hands a declaration that we can be proud of. It's a collective achievement. Finally, Victoria Tali Corpus, chairperson of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, currently UN Special Rapporteur, said, "The 13th of September 2007 will be remembered as an International Human Rights Day for Indigenous peoples, a day that the United Nations and its member states, together with Indigenous peoples, reconciled with past painful histories and decided to march into the future on a new path of human rights." So here we stand today, exactly 10 years to the day from that day in New York. And as we pause to mark this occasion and think deeply about it, we have to note that we do so in a remarkably new political environment since 2007. Here in Canada in 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued its final report with 94 calls to action, calling for the UN Declaration as its framework for reconciliation. In 2016, the new Liberal government on the federal level stated that it is committed to adopting and implementing the declaration. And now in recent weeks, the BC provincial government has made similar commitments. In the meantime, Ecuador and Bolivia have enshrined it into national and constitutional law. New Zealand courts are increasingly citing it, with a few courts in Canada now doing the same. The United Nations and other international mechanisms like the CERD, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, are relying on it in their decision-making processes, including holding states accountable for their lack of implementation. And Indigenous organizations and movements all over the world are using it and invoking it in their advocacy. And yet, the Indigenous world remains under what we could call severe stress. From Brazil to Botswana, from Australia to Ecuador, from Myanmar to Standing Rock, Indigenous peoples are on the front lines, fighting for their cultural survival, their languages, their ways of life, their political and legal institutions, their territories, including both lands and waters, and their lives. In fact, the UN reports that 2016 had the highest number of deaths of human rights defenders than any other year in recorded history. So what can we say? We can say the Declaration is but one tool that Indigenous peoples are using to defend their rights, their cultures, their territories. And in my time tonight, on this very important anniversary, I want to highlight 3 themes that are drawn from my book and which I think are particularly important on this occasion and important for us to keep in mind as we move forward and consider and think about and continue advocacy for Indigenous rights. So theme 1, the UN Declaration is ours. It sounds simple, but it's important to remember. And I was just in New Zealand last week at a UN Declaration conference, and my friend and longtime Maori rights advocate, Aroha Mead, said it best. She said, "It is part of us, and we are part of it. The text is us." There's no doubt that the UN Declaration has grassroots origins. It emerged from the American Indian movement in the 1970s south of the border and the surge in Indigenous activism north of the border following the White Paper of 1969. And the International Treaty Council, Indian Treaty Council, which was one of the first organizations, and there's some dispute over who exactly was first, but it was one of the first to achieve UN status, was born in 1974 out of the ruins of the American Indian movement, only a few short months after the Wounded Knee siege ended in 1973. The Treaty Council itself was founded in 1974 by elders and activists at Standing Rock Reservation, and its founding principles included a push to re-internationalize Indigenous peoples' treaty relationships with governments as Indigenous nations, and secondly, to use the international level along with other avenues to push for and advocate for treaty rights and treaty relationships. At the first Indigenous meeting in Geneva in 1977, an outcome document was produced, completely written by Indigenous peoples and advocates. This document was called the Declaration of Principles. It's important to note that the final draft of the UN Declaration that passed in 2007 contains about 80% of the content of that original 1977 declaration. As with the original 77 text, the final UN Declaration represents a set of guidelines, a framework for state implementation of Indigenous rights. Also, the UN Declaration was drafted and negotiated over almost a 30-year period by Indigenous advocates, states, and UN experts. We have to acknowledge that it's far from a perfect document. My grandmother always said, "How do you know when you've reached a good compromise?" The answer, no one walks away happy. And we can definitely say that was the case with this declaration. Because if someone's too happy, then it means they got too much of their way. And this is certainly not the case with the UN Declaration. Both states and Indigenous peoples emerged unhappy with the final text. It does contain elements that Indigenous peoples never agreed to. It also contains elements that made states fear that some sort of chaos would result, although obviously it didn't happen. The sky hasn't fallen. We haven't had states breaking apart from Indigenous rights. But yet, no one is completely happy with this text. But to me, when I stop and think about it, given the vast power differential between states, and especially very wealthy and powerful states in the world, and grassroots Indigenous peoples on the other, I think it's safe to conclude that Indigenous peoples over that 30-year period were incredibly fierce in the face of unfathomable opposition. And they held their own, using every single tool available to them: protests, walkouts, creative wordsmithing, collective resistance based on consensus decision-making behind the scenes, media pressure, a hunger strike, and increasing skills at diplomacy. I think they were incredibly, unwaveringly strong over 2.5, almost 3 decades. And they did it without thinking or believing for a moment that any one of them would personally ever live to see the day the Declaration was passed. Yet many of them did, and some did not. So I want to pause for a moment and honor each and every one of them and stop to recognize their collective labor and all of their sacrifices all of those years. Second theme, states have always actively and creatively resisted the Declaration, even while claiming to support and uphold it. We must always stay vigilant and continually hold them accountable for this. We have to consistently point out their behavior that is inconsistent with and that falls short of their own statements and their own promises. We must continually point out the facts when states are not in compliance with international human rights standards. A few examples of creative resistance. The final draft of the UN Declaration was written by states alone. In the last few months, Indigenous peoples were no longer in the room and no longer a part of the process. And as a result, the final text includes some highly objectionable provisions. And they're provisions that Indigenous peoples never agreed to, particularly Article 46, which provides extra protections as if they needed more for state sovereignty and territorial integrity. And it removes completely Indigenous peoples' rights to form their own states. Word games. For many years, states insisted on calling Indigenous peoples Indigenous populations, Indigenous groups, or even Indigenous people without the S. Each and every one of these terms are intended to prevent Indigenous peoples from being recognized internationally as having the right of self-determination, which, since the UN Charter of 1945, has been an equal right of all peoples, with an S. The Declaration recognizes that Indigenous peoples do have the right to self-determination equal to all other people, but there was a last-minute word change, a tiny change of preposition, but a potentially significant one in legal terms. You see, in all other human rights instruments since 1945, and in all drafts of the UN Declaration prior to the morning of September 13th, 2007, self-determination is described as a right of self-determination, indicating inherency, part of being human. All peoples have this right as part of their humanity. However, on that last morning, without any announcement, without any clue that it was coming, the English text only, mysteriously changed. Article 3 no longer read that Indigenous peoples have the right of self-determination. It read that Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination, with the word to indicating aspiration, something that could be hoped for, rather than an inherent human right equal to all other human beings. And then I spend some time in the book on concepts like selective endorsement and overcompliance. And these are related concepts which so far seem to be unique in the area of human rights compliance studies. And settler colonial states, meaning Canada, United States, New Zealand, Australia, all engage in these behaviors, which include endorsing an Indigenous rights instrument but giving multiple caveats, footnotes, qualifiers, exclusions. Or it could mean committing to a rights standard that's significantly less than the international consensus, all with the goal of watering down the international standard to meet their current domestic situation. In other words, they take it upon themselves to rewrite the international norms, so that by waving a magic wand, all of their current domestic status quo automatically aligns with their version of the Indigenous rights standard. Except, of course, the magic isn't real. There remains a huge gap between what these countries pledged to do and what they're expected to do under the UN Declaration. In Canada, in particular, there remains a massive gap between what it has pledged to do and what it is actually doing. Third, the Declaration, in order to have any meaning, must be used. It's a living document that will only gather force if we use it, and its ultimate success depends only upon our willingness to use it. It helps us reclaim our humanity, which has been long denied and diminished by nation states, and particularly the settler colonial states. It's both a legal and a political tool, and its strongest potential is when the legal and political are used in tandem and supporting one another. There are important moments when societal political will is more open, but it remains always a delicate dance between pushing and encouraging states, but also holding them accountable. Regardless of its official legal status, which is being worked out in multiple common law courts around the world, it has significant normative value. And with that, I say we must act and speak accordingly. Here in Canada, we're still looking for, and we have a right to expect, a national action plan for implementation, which was promised in the 2015 election, and we have no indication of it yet in place. We have a right to expect a legislative framework for the declaration. We have a right to expect the institution of real partnership decision-making with Indigenous peoples. So I want to close with another very short reading from the conclusion of the book. Following that, I'll ask my fellow panelists to continue addressing the question, where do we go from here? What is next for Indigenous rights? So I'll close with global Indigenous politics, which involves Indigenous rights and the political movements to implement these rights, challenges states and the international system to complete the post-colonial project, to reclaim moral legitimacy and restructure themselves along lines that promote justice, fairness, and human dignity for all. States are not going to implement this multifaceted and complex set of changes on their own. They will require significant political and moral pressure to hold them accountable to the rhetorical commitments they have made. The repeated assertion of Indigenous rights can lead to wider transformative processes that will require sustained political will and commitment over the very long term. But the inevitable end result of such an enhanced decolonization project will be radical systemic change. And with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Dr. Priscilla Settee.
Good evening, relatives. I'm really happy to be here on unceded territories, and I bring greetings from my people, the Swampy Cree. They always have this joke that behind every tree is a Cree. We're the biggest tribal group in Canada. That's what that's our fierce message. So I want to contextualize the declaration with a bit of historical perspective and a bit of contemporary action. And, like everything in life we do, it's always formulated by a frame of reference. And when I was a young woman in the late 70s, I set up meetings with the late George Manuel to visit Indigenous tribes from Mexico to Brazil. And I thought in 6 months that I could actually cover that much territory. And the impetus for that trip throughout these Latin American countries was to try and untangle some of the confusion that I felt when I was in our northern territories teaching among the most beautiful landscapes of all in the world, and yet to also be a part of a very disjointed social fabric and economic fabric. So we're living amongst the most beautiful, forest and waters and everything, resources, relatives, and yet there was extreme poverty. And so as a young woman, I was reading the book Fan Shen on a Chinese revolution, and it really spoke to me that, there's got to be something better than just, what I was seeing. So with that, I set up these meetings with Indigenous tribal groups from Mexico to Brazil and met with many of the leaders there with a very faltering Spanish. And what I discovered was not only what I saw in my own home communities, but actually much worse situations where in Colombia, for example, I arrived in Cartagena, went into the mountains, only to discover that the leader had been shot and killed. In El Salvador, I witnessed, machete wounds to the doors of the villages' homes where in the 40s, Indigenous people were massacred by the thousands. And as a young woman, the stage for my personal and academic development. For at that time I was teaching for the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College, and it literally laid the groundwork for my work today. Later on, I joined the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific movement in the Pacific and heard how the over 140 nuclear bombs left the women of the villages with jellyfish babies that were so horribly impacted by our nuclear bombs from the uranium that comes from my part of the province, the northern part of Saskatchewan. And again, it was one of those moments in history that I'll never forget. It was like going into the villages of Indigenous people, hearing, that they had been murdered, and then to hear the voices of the women in the Pacific to talk about the impact of the nuclear industry in those islands. And this is stuff that never came out. We never learned about it in university, public school. We never learned about it. And I had the good fortune of working also with the Indigenous Women's Network, which was a trans-American network of really powerful Native women who were working on the front lines, and many of whom were at Standing Rock. And later, I worked in Asia and India to learn about some of the colonial policy there, but also to learn about kind of the resurgence of Indigenous tribals in India. Then, during the 90s, I was working at the University of Manitoba in a program called the Engineering Access Program, and there I learned about how the academy was really, training some of our young people to be engineers and frankly, to be part of the problem. So I started a Master's of Education to learn about the impact of Western science on Indigenous communities and put that in a master's thesis. So it was a way of using the academy to start to undo some of the colonial kinds of studies and practices in our communities. In 1996, I took on a non-teaching, non-research faculty appointment at the U of S, which allowed me to continue to network with Indigenous nations throughout the world. And in 2007, was appointed as a teaching and research faculty member. And so I put that out there because I think we in the academy have a huge opportunity, obligation to lead the way, to rise to to some of the challenges that Sheryl set out for us. So in the 2000s, I did my PhD research in Indigenous knowledge systems in South Africa, the Philippines, Hawaii, and Vanuatu. And I specifically picked those countries because they were on the cusp of kind of talking about what does it mean to indigenize the academy. So in South Africa, the African National Congress, of course, rose to power, and it hasn't been the best example of a liberation movement. But one thing that they were doing was looking at the knowledge base of Indigenous African people to try and respond to the terrible colonial system of apartheid. And I traveled throughout South Africa visiting several universities to discover how they were doing that. So this is all documented in the book Bamatswin, which was published in 2015. Also included in that story were some of the liberation movements of Hawaii and in Vanuatu when they kicked out the French in the 1980s and actually took over their own research agenda, including research type of protocols and knowledge translation. So these were extremely interesting moments in my own personal development and academic. Bematsuin emphasizes Indigenous values and compares and contrasts two concepts of power. And this is the book cover. The second book, or actually the first book that Link mentioned, is Keymaw, and it was published in 2011. It's not to brag about these books, but to really talk about them as a showcase for the people that were interviewed, the institutional efforts that were trying to transform the academy, and to, really create this intellectual change that we are all longing for. So in 2011, this was a collection of interviews with 15 Indigenous women. And these were all women that I had worked with on the front lines in Saskatchewan that were really amazing women, artists, environmentalists, teachers. And so these were women whose stories had not been documented. And so I documented them in this book called Keymaw. And in that book, we talked about the importance of relations. And I think one of the things that is missing in a lot of academic work is the explanation of the concepts of what makes Indigenous peoples Indigenous. And I refer here to concepts such as Wahkotowen, which means that we are all related, every one of us in the room. It doesn't matter what color we are, where we come from, or any of those categories, but that we are all responsible to each other, that what we do in life has to set the good way for all, and particularly those coming after us. Mi'owatsidiwin is to do things in a good way. The women talked about, how their leadership differed from maybe traditional leadership, that we don't take care of ourselves first and foremost, but we're actually at the back end, not leading the way, but really following behind to make sure that everyone is safe and provided for. In these stories, a lot of women emphasize the role of family and community as the basic foundations of strong nations. And one of the primary questions in the beginning of the book was, what is the nature of globalization? How does it impact all of us? And these were not women, they were academics, they were very humble women that maybe didn't talk about the impact of globalization, but knew firsthand what the impact on their families and communities. So, let's see. This is the cover of Keymaw called The Strength of Women. So in my work in the Academy in Women and Gender Studies, one of the things that we focus on is research methodologies. We look at processes of training that either empower or disempower women and Indigenous. We find that the economic analysis of today's neoliberal system of governance fails to describe the multiple ways that women have suffered, but not just women, obviously entire communities, under colonization, but also how they have contributed as community organizers, planners, and leaders. So 4 areas of my research that I will just describe briefly and then I'll be finished is research methodologies, making sure that the voices of the underrepresented are front and center. And I'm finding that a lot of the intersectional discussions and actions between Indigenous and feminist research has a very strong relationship. Second area that I'm currently researching is inner city gangs. As we are all very aware, Canada has a huge problem with Indigenous gangs and others. Another more recent research area is climate change and water security, water safety. And then the final area is Indigenous food sovereignty. And I've been teaching Indigenous food sovereignty as a way to connect us with the broader communities, partly because the world is not aware of the contribution of the food systems that are almost entirely Indigenous designed and planned. It's never been compensated, it's seldom recognized in literature or history books, and it is fast disappearing from the face of the earth. So it's estimated that we have lost, in the last 100 or so years, thousands, if not millions, of species. So as we speak, daily, we are losing species that Western science has not even named. But when you live on the ground, you know the changes to the environment and the impact of clear cuts, dams, mines. As I was flying here today, flying over BC and Alberta, and I took pictures of the clear cuts from the planes because it was so shocking. And this is happening, of course, all over the world, and it's having a huge impact on biodiversity, but also on food systems throughout the globe. And, even though governments and scientists are saying, well, we're developing better foods, we're developing more foods, but with the emphasis on single plants and single crops, it doesn't take rocket science to understand that, with one bad year, we rely in Canada on 3 species of potatoes, and that could be wiped out with one bad disease. So for me, Indigenous food sovereignty is a way of networking with others. We all need food and water to exist. And we are, food is in critical condition, and it's having huge impacts in our communities. We have highest diabetes rates in the world. We have diseases that were once wiped out are now making a comeback, like tuberculosis and waterborne diseases. We have 163 communities that are under boil water advisories. So there's so much information to teach students about and to learn myself about that, a topic like Indigenous food sovereignty is a really excellent place to start and continue. So, I was just going to mention the 163 drinking water advisories are in place in 119 First Nations in Canada. And more than 100 are routinely in effect, some for years or decades. And a month ago, I gave a talk at the University of Manitoba, and I read to the audience the story of this young woman from Northern Ontario. The water was so in bad shape that she had to bathe her little boy with bottled water. And I'm not capturing the devastation of that community, but just to say that, the media never accurately portrays these pictures. And if things are going to change, it's because we're after government to bloody well step up to the plate and honor the terms and conditions in part of the declaration, but also as an opportunity to remind Canadians in general that it is also, the responsibility of all citizens to step up to the plate and recognize that in Canada, just as in Latin America, where I was 40 years ago, the human rights of Indigenous people are being trampled today, and we see it every day in our research. Finally, to be an Indigenous woman and to be an Indigenous person is to be of service to your community, not to earn full professorship or get the latest publication, but to be of service to community for the little ones coming after us and for the sake of preserving this world that we know. We have never been, at least I haven't heard about it, in the state that we've been in where, we are that close to, could be nuclear annihilation, where the world's budgets put towards wars is obscene, where there are whole regions of the world where children die every day and the media doesn't cover it, including here in Canada. So this neoliberalism has given rise to social movements with new forms of leadership, reflected in the growth of new scholarship and activism. I'm an activist scholar first. I can't separate the two. And secondly, that women's role is central in everything we do, including the food sovereignty movement. That it took La Via Campesina to tell us that if women were getting beat up by their spouse, they could no longer provide for their family. They could no longer preserve the food. They could no longer save the precious seeds when chemical companies all around us are trying to destroy those. So women's security and women's safety and the honoring of women must be central to the movement. And finally, we must develop solidaritous chains of humanity. We are in this struggle together. Unfortunately, it's Indigenous people that are on the front line, still suffering the consequences of 1,000-year-old colonialism and imperialism. So there is no time to waste. And as my students will tell you, they are required to serve working time in community to understand what are some of the problems that are faced within the community. They are required to work in teams so that they get to compare brain messages and strategies. And sometimes they do it kicking and screaming, but my classes are always full, so I guess we have some solutions. So I want to thank you for coming out. I want to thank you for listening, and I want to thank you for being interested in, what the meaning of this declaration is about. What kinds of challenges does it pose for us, all of us, because we are one humanity. Wahotuen, thank you.
Bujun dinaway maganaduk Kiiwetinepinesiik indigo bujun dodem mikanakwa joing nin dunjaba. As Link so nicely stated, I liked that bio. I was like, oh, I sound really good in that. I'm Heidi Kiiwetinepinesiik. I'm Anishinaabe from Turtle Mountain, and I too just want to acknowledge the Musqueam on whose lands we're meeting on today. I also just want to take a minute to acknowledge Sarah Hunt and all the hard work she did in putting this event together, because getting academics to do anything is really an exercise in herding cats. So I'm very appreciative for the work she's done to make it possible for us to be together, also for the fellow panelists for their words, and of course for Sheryl Lightfoot for all the hard work she's done, both, I think something that comes out much more clearly in the book than even has been said today is that Sheryl was really involved in working kind of on the ground at the UN around the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and is able to bring forward all kinds of insights about the kind of context in which the Declaration was being formulated because of that work that she was doing, as well as with the Policy Institute in Minneapolis. So I'd just like to thank Sheryl for her work and for this opportunity to be able to engage her work and share some thoughts with you. So while often treated as marginal non-state actors, Sheryl Lightfoot instead shows us that Indigenous rights at the global level have been largely ignored because they challenge conventional notions of sovereignty, territoriality, liberalism, and human rights. She posits that alternative visions put forward by Indigenous leaders could prove revolutionary if they're taken up. And this is the point that I want to give some cautionary remarks around, as well as highlight some of the opportunities that come forward in her text. So she highlights that UNDRIP adds collective rights to the international human rights consensus, opening a wider door for collective rights acceptance, places attention on the global dilemma of how to apply universals that simultaneously allow for difference, that global Indigenous politics imagines and practices international relations differently, incorporating Indigenous political structures and systems into international politics, and pushes meanings of decolonization and self-determination in new terrain beyond purely status conceptions. And she highlights in the concluding chapter that what lays ahead for UNDRIP and for all of us is really going to be seen in the active deployment, where she says it's in the active deployment path where the real potential lies. And so thinking about global Indigenous politics, as someone who's done a lot of work on treaties and law, I couldn't help but find myself wanting to come down from the global and start at the local and think about what kinds of lessons we have that we can draw on from our history of our relationships with newcomers to our territories. That might be helpful in giving us insight into both the challenges and opportunities available from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So if we look to the local level, I think we can see that Indigenous nations sought to establish and develop meaningful relationships with newcomers coming into their territory, which is not to say that there weren't also those who resisted encroachment onto territories and so on. But many of these early relationships would be carried forward and kind of re-articulated through treaty negotiations. But we see that, looking back, having the luxury of time and history on our side here, we can look back and see that the written text of these documents are often interpreted in ways that give a very narrow attention to the true meaning and intent laid out by Indigenous leaders. And we know this through the various articulations that still get put forward today by Indigenous leaders that call on the state and its citizens to recognize treaties as living relationships, asserting that the original spirit and intent recognizes, of course, that treaties are to last as long as the rivers flow, the sun shines, and so on. And yet we see, much like UNDRIP, this attention to state sovereignty and territorial integrity as being a real rub for the state as it thinks about its obligations and responsibilities under treaty commitments, in which treaty documents are interpreted primarily as cessions of land and fixed contracts, which is quite inconsistent with the aspirations put forward by Indigenous leaders. And I think more recently, if we look to kind of a national level, as Indigenous nations were continuing to find the state failing to implement treaties in accordance with their original intent and meaning, you see a lot of activism and galvanizing of Indigenous leaders towards the national level, seeking constitutional entrenchment of Aboriginal and treaty rights to ensure that our voices, our original visions about living together could be met more faithfully. And so with Section 35, there was, again, another kind of set of language that was brought forward by Indigenous activists that contained much of the aspirations for what the relationship with the state could look like. And yet now we know that in many ways, Section 35, while having allowed us to make some gains, has also in some ways really taken a narrow interpretation of what Aboriginal and treaty rights are, and has left little room for Indigenous articulations of nationhood and relationships to land to come forward. But we have seen some advancements made on the ground. And so, I just am thinking of Priscilla's comments tonight and the ways in which she's really articulated the actual conditions in which we find ourselves living. We have me my water. And so it's in these conditions that whether we find language to be constrained or, thank you, to in some ways be drained of some of its original vitality and meaning, we also recognize that something has to happen now, right? That our uncles, our aunties are being arrested for carrying out their relationships with creation, right? We have young people who are struggling to have access to drinking water. And it was in these moments, and I think especially as Priscilla highlighted, it was in these moments where people's lives were on the line on a daily basis, that many had to look beyond the state as a place to find protection and as a way to find a room to articulate and bring forward what living together could look like. And so it's in that activism and in that movement towards the international realm that many Indigenous leaders had hoped we could bring forward articulations of how to live together that would be met with a meaningful response. So I just again want to reflect then on what we've learned from treaty implementation and what we've learned from Section 35 that can help us to think through some of the challenges and opportunities of UNDRIP. Right, we know that in Section 35, again, when we think about things like free, prior, and informed consent, that the duty to consult is, again, language that could prove meaningful, and yet in many ways has not been implemented in ways to actually enable meaningful consultation. We see that there might be a recognition of Aboriginal title, but again, that recognition is always tethered by this recognition of state sovereignty and dominion over the land. And I think that then when we look to these narrow interpretations of treaty relationships or the narrow interpretations coming out of Section 35, we can see that the real opportunities in these documents sit in what we decide to do with them. And that's very much, I think, the message that Cheryl tries to bring forward in the conclusion of the book, that it's really up to each of us to not only call on states to meaningfully apply the UN Declaration, but as she said, her third point is that it has to be used to have meaning, right? That it's also how we decide to use it that's going to determine what kinds of changes will be possible with the UN Declaration. And so with that, I would say that the important thing then is not for us to be overly focused on the language itself, right? Because one of the things that I think, all this desire to find legal protections in the courts has taught us is that we can't put all of our energy towards a single cause, right? So we have to be cautious to make sure that we're taking a diverse approach to building a better tomorrow for our children, right? So we can't put all of our eggs, if you'll say, in that kind of global basket. But in the efforts that we put forward towards achieving kind of greater global recognition of Indigenous rights, we also have to make sure that we continue to convey the philosophies and teachings and meanings that really gave content and meaning to the UN Declaration. So what does it mean to be self-determining? And so when I think about this, I reflect often on this common story told among the Anishinaabe about this time when we had forgot how to live in balance with creation and had ultimately flooded the world. And as the earth was being covered with water, if you think in many ways this mirrors the kind of world we live in today, where the rising waters of colonialism are kind of threatening to consume the world as we've understood it, we found ourselves drifting afloat. And in our stories, it's our central character, our trickster, who finds himself afloat in this vast amount of water and comes upon a log and finds refuge on that log, where him and a number of animals work together to dive to the bottom to bring up a bit of earth to build the world anew. And it's both in that engagement with one another that they're able to envision a new way forward out of this mass of water, but it's also in bringing up the foundations that are below them that they're able to build something new, not out of nothing, but out of the earth that came before. And so I think that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in many ways is the log that can help us stay afloat in the rising kind of tide of colonialism. But we must make sure that at the same time we're constantly diving down and ensuring that we're bringing back up a bit of that earth that really sustains and nurtures our people so that we have a foundation from which to build the world anew again. Miigwech.
Oh, blinded by the light up here. I also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the unceded territory that this event is being hosted on, and to thank the Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh people for allowing us to be here, and as well to extend the thanks to my fellow panelists, to Sarah Hunt, who I literally cannot see at the moment, for again organizing all of this. It takes a tremendous amount of effort, and I am very appreciative. I guess I'm just going to jump right into it. For the past several decades, Indigenous rights have been in a constant state of reconsideration. The international arena has proved a simultaneously interesting and perplexing avenue for assessment, negotiation, and the affirmation of those rights. The process to and the eventual adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples spanned decades, and it is a testament to the strength of Indigenous activism and diplomacy. There is no denying that the passage of UNDRIP marked a critical moment in the recognition of Indigenous rights. But beyond that recognition, as Lightfoot notes in her book, the adoption of UNDRIP has forever changed international relations and the application of politics. Further, her analysis of state resistance to global Indigenous politics breaks silences and seeks to answer questions seemingly unanswerable by traditional international relations theory. This critique develops a deeper understanding of the ways Indigenous politics challenges conventions and forces structural change. Scholars to date have been quick to fall into one of two camps: those who draw attention to the states failing to implement UNDRIP, and those who really hold up UNDRIP as monumental and taking a long time for the states to kind of adjust to implement. Substantial attention has yet to really be focused on implementation of UNDRIP and how that might impact Indigenous peoples on the ground. Given the examination of compliance that Lightfoot talks about extensively in her book, and in particular on the nature of settler state compliance, a more critical assessment would include how political promises of implementation may become yet another manifestation of colonial violence due to their subjection to domestic processes. For example, when we consider that the Anglosphere has given support to the Declaration with two important caveats. First, its existence as an aspirational document, and its implementation through domestic law. We must consider how the implementation of the Declaration through domestic channels may thwart aspects of Indigenous rights. More specifically, as Indigenous peoples, we understand our rights and responsibilities to be fluid and evolving an evolving relationship with our territories. We don't conceptualize them as static or as frozen in a moment of time. It's an evolving relationship. Yet what domestic processes have managed to achieve, in particular in Canada, when dealing with Section 35, is to freeze those rights in a specific moment in time, thereby denying these rights the possibility of evolution over time as circumstances change. Almost 2 years ago, Canada's relatively rocky relationship with the Declaration, first it's eager, I guess, on board with the Declaration, really behind developing the Declaration, and then at the last, towards the end, really saying that they weren't on board anymore, and with a final vote of no at the UN forum. That relationship seemed to be changing with the federal election, bringing in the Liberal Party under Justin Trudeau. This notion was furthered again when the Canadian Minister of Indigenous Affairs made a statement at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in May of last year. However, an analysis of Carolyn Bennett's remarks suggests business as usual in Canada, while simultaneously creating the illusion of compliance. This illusion of compliance is one that can be categorized as selective endorsement, which Lightfoot describes as a state engaged in strategic logic while maintaining its position in the global community, where complying with human rights norms is constitutive of belonging. It goes without saying that on an international level, Canada has successfully maintained an image and among the world leaders on on human rights in general. But this illusion is a position that this illusion, maybe I should take a breath. This illusion is one that the government wants to maintain. Nobody wants to be seen as backwards in terms of human rights, and I think it's something that Canada really strives to focus on, and having done a fair amount of traveling outside of the country, it's one that I've seen a lot that people draw on. With that in mind, Carolyn Bennett began the bulk of her statement back in May of last year, stating on behalf of Canada and under the new political regime that we're now a full supporter of the Declaration without qualifications. What's particularly perplexing about this affirmation is that without qualifications is promptly followed by, we intend nothing less than to adopt the Declaration in accordance with the Canadian Constitution. And the affirmation that Canada is already a leader in the recognition of Indigenous rights due to their incorporation in Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. The declaration of full support is immediately qualified by the suggestion that compliance is already in place in the Canadian system, a notion that many, if not all, Indigenous peoples would find comical. To further this selective endorsement of the Declaration, Bennett goes on to describe the modern treaty process, which if you live in British Columbia, you are very familiar with, as the ultimate expression of free, prior, and informed consent. Just really getting those jabs right in there. While seemingly suggesting that this model is an effective and true reflection of the implementation of UNDRIP. Despite affirmation that discussions would occur with Indigenous communities, it's over a year later since that first affirmation that Canada fully supports the Declaration, and I would argue that we are no closer to full implementation. While the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples should not be understated, the Declaration, like Indigenous and treaty rights, is one wing of Indigenous diplomacy. The other wing is political action and strategy. We cannot stand idly by and wait for governments, political parties, or courts to act. We are inherently self-determining peoples, despite the two self-determination that's eloquently laid out in the Declaration. And we have the authority for that, to assert that implementation at every avenue. It is our inherent responsibility to future generations to assert these rights. Within Lightfoot's book, deliberate attention is drawn to the utilization of collective action, as she mentioned earlier this evening, to that collective action in the Indigenous rights movement. It's collective action, the utilization of peaceful protests, resistance, and diplomacy that ultimately led to the adoption of UNDRIP. In the same way that we see the importance of collective action at the international level, so too does collective action pave the way for social change at the local level. The significance of resistance and protest to provoke change cannot be understated. It is a constant and active assertion of our rights and responsibilities. We see this unfold on a continual basis with nations leading peaceful protests. I could literally stand here for hours telling you all the ones that I know. Focus mostly on BC, we have BC or Indigenous nations in the province actively asserting that they don't want certain energy projects, Enbridge, Kinder Morgan. We also have active resistance against fish farms. And yes, active, and the Site C Dam. I did note one more. These pathways of action and resistance ultimately lead to structural change, as has been evident in the protests that have happened in the past, Oka Crisis, Adel Namor, for example. And so, on the 10th anniversary of UNDRIP, a pertinent question for all of us is, what would it mean if we took the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples seriously? What does it mean to do a lot more than just pay lip service to it, than to go to international forums and say that Canada as a whole fully supports the declaration and will implement it with no concrete action since? While I would caution that there is absolutely room in the declaration for imposed and restricted definitions or understandings in each of the articles, taking this declaration seriously, fully implementing it, or as Premier John Horgan most recently said, governing the province in accordance with the principles of the declaration, that fully means giving control back to Indigenous communities. This specifically goes beyond consultation, which has to date been a mechanism by which the provincial and federal governments can suggest they are meeting international commitments while simultaneously disregarding the demands of Indigenous nations. When I say go beyond consultation, I specifically mean consent. Taking the declaration seriously means taking free, prior, and informed consent to heart, and guiding our discussions with that in mind. Full implementation still requires Indigenous diplomacy just as much as it requires our continued action and assertion of our rights. I do want to note that that in no way negates the very real situation in a lot of our communities. Communities in crisis need allies just as much as they need those situations to be dealt with, because it becomes very hard to be able to hang out at Parliament Hill in buildings that sometimes are really hard to get into and demand change when you don't have clean drinking water. So I also want to thank Priscilla for making that really real and bringing that into this room as well. With diplomacy, continued action, and the continued assertion of our rights, with these things working together, we can move toward a relationship that's built on mutual respect and equal partnership. Kleko.
Grand Chief Phillip is our last speaker, but he has asked, I believe, that one of the people who works with him read a statement first. So, Rachel.
Thank you. So this is a statement prepared by the Coalition on the Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and I work for the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and we're one of the members of that coalition. The statement looks like this. It's at the back of the room, and if there's not enough copies, do come ask me. And we've also got small pocket-sized copies of the declaration back there, which we can make available in large quantities if you would like them. So I'm not going to read the whole statement, but the important parts. So a decade after the adoption of the Declaration, Canada still lacks concrete and effective mechanisms to uphold its provisions. This is despite many positive statements from the current government committing to fully implement the declaration, as Rachel was saying so eloquently. Last month, the United Nations top anti-racism body, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, strongly supported Indigenous peoples in urging Canada to adopt a legislative framework and national action plan to implement the UN Declaration. And the full section of that statement is at the back of the room also. A private member's bill expected to come before the House of Commons this fall for second reading, named Bill C-262, which was introduced by MP Romeo Saganash, contains elements for such a framework. This includes repudiation of colonialism and doctrines of superiority, affirmation that the standards set out in the UN Declaration have application in Canadian law, and review and reform of federal legislation to ensure consistency with the minimum standards set out in the UN Declaration. In addition, the bill requires that a national action plan be developed in partnership with Indigenous peoples. By approaching implementation of the Declaration through a legislative framework, there is greater assurance that crucial progress made will not be undone by a future government. So we have a government that's willing to make these ritualistic statements right now. We need them to put in legislation to make sure it doesn't go backwards. Our organizations and nations call on the federal government to embrace and build on the key elements of implementation already set out in Bill C-262. We appreciate that full implementation of the Declaration requires long-term commitment and collaboration. As the Truth and Reconciliation Commission repeatedly reminded us, reconciliation is going to take hard work. This is the time to act. Public responses to the TRC's calls to action demonstrate a profound desire among Canadians to build a just relationship between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous Canadians. As the TRC itself stated, the Declaration provides the framework for doing so. However, putting this framework into place requires more than fine words. It requires concrete, effective action. And with that, someone who takes a lot of concrete and effective action, Grand Chief Stewart Phillip.
Thank you, Rachel. Rachel's one of our policy analysts for the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and we greatly rely on her for the good work she does for our organization. Heidi Kiiwetinepinesiik Stark. In our Ensilichan language, that's simply good day, my dear friends and relatives. My traditional name is Asiut. I want to begin by acknowledging the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the Musqueam, on whose traditional territory we have the distinct privilege of being together here this evening. I would also like to thank the organizers that have brought us together this evening to have this incredibly important conversation. And of course, I would like to thank each and every one of you for taking the time to come out and be part of this discussion. I've been involved in the affairs of our people now for pretty much 43 years. And so when I first got involved, it was during the times of the Red Power movement. And it was incredibly politically volatile times back in the day, as we say, and there was an incredible sense of social consciousness that was sweeping North America. We had the civil rights movement in the U.S., the anti-Vietnam War movement, the peace movement and of course the Red Power movement. And young people were swept up and consumed by what was going on throughout the world, and felt a sense of duty and obligation to get involved. And they were absolutely wonderful times. The music was great back then. I still listen to classic vinyl. And quite often I'm somewhat nostalgic about back in the day. Interestingly, my wife, and I don't like using that term, I prefer to think of myself as Joan's husband, she was involved in the Red Power movement before myself, and she was involved with the Native Alliance for Red Power. And she was a very young lady at the time, and actually had to sneak out of her bedroom and shinny down a tree to go to different events. She went to Frank's Landing in Washington State, and the National Guard was out, and it was a fishing rights dispute. And Joan has been pretty much my guiding light. She was aware of the international scope of Indigenous rights way back, long before many of us began to realize the world is much bigger than British Columbia or Canada or North America as far as that goes. There were a lot of incredible people involved in the movement back in the day, and sadly many of them are gone. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge their contribution and their sacrifices and the good work that they've done to bring us to this place that we're at. My wife and I used to have absolutely incredible arguments over these issues. And needless to say, I was far less informed than she was, and it didn't take her long to convert me and make me realize, the true history of the world, which is pretty crappy in terms of Indigenous peoples, human rights, capitalism, and all of those terrible things that have created the world condition as we know it. I remember back in the days of the debate around the wording of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I remember the debate around the issue of people versus peoples. And I remember the celebration then when we were successful in having the word peoples incorporated into the Declaration. I also remember when it finally went to the vote in the UN, and there was definitely a sense of celebration and jubilation and a tremendous amount of hope 10 years ago. And we were not impressed with the government of Canada voting against it, as well as Australia, New Zealand, and the US. And back in those days, there was a lot of activism, a lot of demonstrations and marches and so on and so forth. And we were able to bludgeon Canada into seeing the light and with great reluctance signing on to the Declaration. We had pretty much a decade being in the trenches fighting the Harper government. And it may shock you that sometimes I would much prefer to fight with an individual like Mr. Harper, who was absolutely racist and was a terrible prime minister. And now we have Mr. Selfie, Justin Trudeau, the charmer, who believes that somehow he can achieve reconciliation between the federal crown and Indigenous peoples through selfies. And the eloquent statements that he makes publicly about the need to move forward on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the 94 calls to action with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I remember October the 20th, the day after the election, when we couldn't believe that Mr. Harper was gone. And there was a sense of hope, and that there would be space and opportunity to move our issues forward. We were engaged in a very, very vigorous campaign against the Site C Dam, against Lilu Island, the massive LNG facility that was being promoted by the former BC Liberal government in Petronas, the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline. And we were hugely disappointed after the election when Mr. Trudeau and his government approved the permits for Site C, approved Lilu Island. I believe they did it late Friday, very sneaky before a long weekend. And of course, green lighting the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline, knowing full well that there was enormous Indigenous opposition to those projects. The violation of Treaty 8's treaty rights flies in the face of Mr. Trudeau's eloquent, warm, fuzzy statements about nothing is more important to this government than a nation-to-nation relationship with the Indigenous peoples of this country. So after 10 years of hope, we find ourselves in a place that, the genocide continues. The tragic deaths of our people continue unabated. The missing and murdered women issue is a prime example. The increased incarceration rates of Indigenous peoples, particularly Indigenous women. The continuing apprehension of our children in unprecedented numbers. All of those, the homelessness, the poverty, the fentanyl crisis that is taking so many Indigenous lives as well as other lives, the continued marginalization of Indigenous peoples. You heard about the fact that fundamental human right to clean water, clean drinking water, and yet this country has so many Indigenous communities that are subject to advisories that prevents them from using their domestic water systems. So it's an absolutely appalling set of statistics that represent the reality of the Indigenous peoples in this country. Now, I believe that we owe a debt of gratitude to those leaders that have went before us, our traditional and hereditary leaders, our spiritual leaders who have guided us throughout this long, arduous, difficult journey. But I can't help but believe that it will not be the leaders that determine the outcome of governments fully, honestly, and truly implementing the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I believe that it's going to be Indigenous women, Indigenous youth, and the grassroots people that are going to have to carry the ball. And I think that the conditions are so dire in our communities that we saw a glimpse of the power of our grassroots people through the Idle No More movement in December of 2012, that within the matter of a few short weeks went international right around the globe. And there were demonstrations outside Canadian embassies all around the world. And the international community was asking, what's that all about? What are those protesters out there for? And whatnot. And I believe the intransigence of government, the denial of government is going to bring us to that place. The Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline is going to be an interesting challenge for all of us. And I would just like to thank our academics in our Indian country, so to speak. World history has taught us that all revolutions, all liberation movements have included young people, have included students, and have included the intellectual people of that particular movement to provide the correct way to proceed with organizing this movement. On the upside, I've been involved for 4 decades, and it really lifts my spirits in today's world that when we march through the streets of Vancouver in opposition to Kinder Morgan or other issues, we are not alone. In the early days of the Red Power movement, we stood alone, and we marched in the streets alone. But now there's an enormous level of participation and support coming from all walks of life, all echelons of society. And I particularly remember the Idle No More movement. And there was a very elegant elderly lady marching beside me, and she looked at me and she said, "You know, you're our only hope." And I said, "No," I said, "together. You know, we have to make this journey together, and we will succeed." And I believe that to be the case. I think the thing that underlies all of this, and it was referenced by our very knowledgeable panel, our very articulate panel, is the land. It's the land and the water that is bringing us together. Because as grandparents, as parents, as human rights advocates, we are beginning to know and understand that Mother Earth is needing a dramatic shift, an absolute paradigm shift from what is happening in the world and the impacts of those decisions and those value systems and those economic structures that support the exploitation of the land for profit, for economic and business gain. And as you've heard at the outset, Jonah and I have been blessed with 15 grandchildren. And for the grandparents in the audience, when you become a grandparent, you see the world differently. When I first began my journey, I was very, very angry. I had long hair, I had a red headband, I had sunglasses, I wore a military fatigue jacket, I had Vietnam jungle combat boots, and I was, what motivated me was hate. And I've come to realize, as our panelists said, we're truly, in every sense of the word, we're in this together. And we have a responsibility to each other and to the land and to all living things to come together and do what we need to do to reverse this. In our universal culture, you hear the expression, all of my relations. And the essence of that phrase is it extends itself to not just our sisters and brothers, it extends itself to the land, to the water, to all of the creatures that rely on the land and the water being in a very healthy state. It's what the residential school was about. Most people have some sense, but the real intention of the residential schools was to do away with our spiritual connection to the land And by doing away with our language, our culture, and traditions, our laws are incorporated in that. And from the time we're toddlers, we're taught what our duties and obligations are to the land, to each other, to our spirituality and our language and culture. And that's what the colonizer attempted to destroy. And the agenda of assimilation and extinguishment is very much with us, regardless of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and so on and so forth. So collectively, we have to bring sufficient pressure to bear on the Trudeau government and on Mr. Horgan, who has made some very broad commitments to the First Nations people of the province in terms of adopting the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the 94 calls to action with respect to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And having been around the block a few times, when I heard those statements, on the one hand, I embraced them, and on the other hand, I thought, I think I've seen this movie before, because he's just repeating what Mr. Trudeau had said during the last federal election. So I just want to end by again thanking all of you for coming out this evening, and we need to do our utmost to begin talking to our relatives, our neighbors, about the reality of global warming, climate change, the wildfires, the flooding, all of the catastrophic events we witness around the world. And there's something that really isn't covered, but I believe as we move on into the future, given the trajectory of climate change, is disease. And, we started out with Lyme disease, and then we moved to West Nile virus, and now there's reports of Zika mosquitoes, coming into the southern parts of the country, of Canada. And so we have to do something to change this world we live in. That's our responsibility as friends and neighbors, as human beings, as grandparents and parents, as leaders. We have that obligation, and we need to stand up, we need to speak out, and we need to show up. And when we have demonstrations and marches, it's our effort to send a very strong message, not only to governments, but to industry, that enough is enough. And so there will be some more of those types of activities, I suspect, in the upcoming weeks. And I sincerely hope that you find a bit of time to come out and support those events. So again, I thank you for being here. Wai Lim Lim.
This has been quite an evening with a lot of really quality thinking. And I hope you'll join me once again in thanking our panelists. Once had another person from the community next to where my family comes from talking in our program with some of our staff, and he said, in the Lakota world, if we agree that we're going to do something at a particular time, that means that we actually think it would be a good idea if that happened, but it may happen or it may not, depending on how it works. And all of my colleagues and staff turned to me and laughed, because I guess I didn't have a really good reputation for always showing up on time. And the reason I'm telling you this is that we promised you that there would be time for questions, and it's It's 9 o'clock. And, I've got this watch. I have to use it once in a while. So what I would like to suggest is that we might want to go downstairs before all the food's gone, and that you might want to pose your questions directly to the members of our panel. And is that acceptable to everyone? Okay, and so given that, I want to invite you to come and talk with the panelists and each other and have some food. And thank you once again for coming and being part of this event. And there it is.